Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for attending this panel that is about translation in teaching. There is a slight change. One of our colleagues and speakers, Patricia Sobral, from the Department of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies, unfortunately is not well, and so she had to withdraw from this presentation, feeling very sorry about it, but we will proceed with the speakers that we have. So you probably know that already that in the interest of time, I'm not going to give the full bios of the speakers so that they can have all the time to present the work they're going to be sharing with them. I'm Nydia Schumacher and the Hispanic Studies Department, and it's a great pleasure to welcome my three colleagues. I will start with Nicolas Kakufa. Welcome back, Nicolas. A few years ago, he was the moderator and I was sitting there. I was very amused when I saw that. Anyway, Nicolas comes from Columbia University, where he is a lecturer in the program in Hellenic Studies, and he's going to talk to us about translation as a queer hospitality, recycling languages in the second language classroom. So you have the floor.
Thank you. Let me start by saying that I'm wearing my sunglasses not because my vanity has reached Mount Olympus, but because I have an issue with my eye, so I do apologize. I do think it's quite rude, but me doing this and crying at the same time would have been an issue as well. So I appreciate your kindness in staring at this. I would also like to start by thanking Jane, the organizers in general, for bringing me here again after 4 years. Brown, to be honest, with Elsa and Stephanie and a number of other people, feels like an extended family to me. So there's so much I could say about my positive experiences here, but we don't have much time. So I'll just get into the part of my talk that's hopefully the interesting part. Another disclaimer, there's two of us doing modern Greek, so I didn't want to have too many examples. So I'm using one example, but my PowerPoint has more, and I'd be happy to talk about it further during the discussion part. Quote, "We construct our queerness, don't we? Mine doesn't look like yours. My friend explains that a queer space is one where you don't have to explain yourself. But I find myself explaining myself to myself. Is my mind not a queer space? Is my body? Strangers talk to me less and frown at me more now that I look the way I do." So writes the Beirut-based non-binary writer and performer Dima Mikhail Mata in her essay, "This Text is a very lonely document," part of the anthology This Arab is Queer, published in 2022 in English by Saki Press, making it the first anthology of its kind ever to be published, not in Arabic, in English, because it doesn't exist in Arabic. What does it mean to construct one's own queerness, and how does one explain it to their own self? Mata here perfectly encapsulates, in my view, that being queer is what Brian James Baer has referred to in queer theory and translation studies as a, quote, translative condition, always in process in a globalized world. As he notes, translation can help us to understand the transnational and culturally specific, different, dissident, and diverse modes of queerness and its circulation in a way that resists the superimposition of a Western, acritical mode of being that refuses to take into consideration the different sets of historical, material, and ideological conditions that have shaped and are still shaping queer bodies across the world. Such conversations are often taken up within the context of current debates on queer postcolonial studies, for example, and translation studies. Think of Venutis's work on the politics of translation, but very little has been done, at least in modern Greek, about the role of language learning in particular, its pedagogical affordances and its processes as a very important step that's usually ignored in this decolonizing process whose aim is, to quote Bayer again, to open up, quote, counter-hegemonic approaches to the study of sex and sexuality across languages and cultures. But I would also add, also within language and beside. Most scholarship on the topic assumes that such critical literacy interventions exist or are only able to exist when someone is already in the position of knowing more than one language. Well, I wholeheartedly disagree with that. Language learning is hard. It does not happen in an ideological void, not within academic institutions at least. The kind of skills and literacies we can engage and give to our students in our language classrooms are multifaceted, and an enriched teaching repertoire that includes translation allows us to consider multiple perspectives, including the ability to decenter, debate, and critique not only what language says, but also what language does. Let me make a very brief deviation that would allow me to come out and contextualize this claim in my current roles and teaching experience. In my 16 years that I have been teaching modern Greek, I have had the chance to start from no methodology, let's just follow the textbook teaching approach 16 years ago, to the holistic, the textbook is an indicator, I don't really care about textbooks, they're not my syllabus, okay, let's move forward. The type of language approach that my refugee students needed, the immigrants I taught in Cyprus needed, the Erasmus students, and for the past 10 years, my college students require is very, very different. Clearly defined goals based on our student body, therefore, and the pedagogical tools that we need to employ to achieve them is very important. Especially if one understands this language learning, as in my case, for example, as the introduction the students get not only in the language as an everyday function, but also as an introduction to a discipline, and at the same time as a necessary skill to have to be able to navigate a minor special concentration in modern Greek and Hellenic studies. Within this context, I have found that the use of translation as a pedagogical tool in crafting specific tasks from elementary to advanced, it's very important to my teaching, both in terms of connections, but also in terms of a critical pedagogical framework that promotes multiliteracies. Contrary to popular belief, I'm not only teaching my students how to order a spanakopita or a frappe in Greek, but I'm also requiring them to engage with a rich culture and tradition and to understand it in connection to its Mediterranean context and its global implications, while I also prepare them to be able to interact with cultural material in the target language. As we all know, this is not an easy task. One needs to remain faithful to the target language while also remaining attentive to the elements of novelty that the, quote, foreigner brings. How not, therefore, to succumb to assimilating and absorbing the other, in my case, the queer other, into the same. In effect, omitting the singularity of the other coming from a different space, while also simultaneously breaking down and maintaining the basic structures and linguistic norms. To honor both host and guest languages, all experiences. Such a practice in the language classroom allows for the recognition of the fragility of language as a never-ending task. We judge translations in the classrooms when I ask students to do translation by another translation, an alternative translation. It's an open process again and again and again. And that's a skill they need beyond translating or doing queer translation. That's a skill they need about understanding language itself or existing in the language itself. In the language classroom, therefore, translation, and in this case, queer translation, is not only a form of interlinguistic negotiation, but also one of intralinguistic and cultural negotiation as well, especially when incited by the processes of migration, displacement, and heritage and diaspora. In the elementary 1 classroom, for example, I include the Gender Unicorn activity, which was designed by the Trans Student Educational Resources Group. And we use an AI-generated translation tool in order for them to see the limits of this practice. The failure of the AI to understand and translate this invites us to consider multiple perspectives, to inquire into possible alternatives and personally reflect on the issue. It also allows me as the instructor to not only recycle terms from the queer global lexicon, while also simultaneously teaching my students about them. Many of them don't understand what they're seeing in the gender unicorn, but also to give agency to the students in regard to how does one construct their own queerness anew in a different language that is still in the process of defining such terms of its own speakers. Many of my colleagues in a number of different languages usually share their frustration with me by the fact that the students have requests from the language, for example, the they, them pronouns, but quote, but we don't have that in Greek. We don't have them in so many languages. What are we going to do them? What are we going to do with that? It does not work like that. As instructors, though, we do not only teach the standard and dominant version of our languages, but also the languages generated and created in other venues, such as queer collectives or immigrant communities in those countries. When engaging in such an act of translation in elementary one, a couple of weeks into the semester, the second month of the semester, one also gets to critically think about these notions, such as translatable and untranslatable. The word queer, for example, which is always the same word in Greek, and it becomes queer, queer, queer. That does not only problematize the understanding of the word queer, but also the ways in which my students will eventually engage with producing meaning in their target language at large. Queer bodies, very similar to translation, are often deemed historically unnatural, lacking compared to an imagined original, and non-reproductive. They have both been demonized, quote unquote, within nationalist discourses because they are seen as contrary to the strengthening of the nation. This has been the case in Greece and Cyprus as well. I personally do not aspire to create a classroom that is sanitized of all other languages than the target ones. Translanguaging in this time and age is unavoidable. What I would argue, based on my own practice, is that the use of translation activities in the L2 classroom offers the opportunity to indeed utilize this innate and spontaneous translanguaging, where the boundaries between languages are fluid and constantly shifting, into the pedagogical translanguaging, where we get to mine its endless possibilities through specifically designed instructional strategies that integrate two or more language into a pedagogic theory and practice, as Sines and Cordes and Cummings have suggested. Translation, I would argue, offers the necessary space for critical linguistic disidentification, to bring in Esteban Munoz and queer theory, and the critical recycling of not only the linguistic sign, but also its performative aspects. Sylvia Wynter's call in Rethinking Aesthetics for a turn towards decipherment as opposed to interpretation or translation of the play of meanings and significations that a text produces could be applied, in my view, to the ways in which translation is incorporated in our teaching repertoire for the L2 classroom. This is what I'm asking the students to do when I ask them to find who they are in modern Greek. Sometimes they don't get to just translate or just say the same thing. They need to think. They need to decipher the meaning in that language. It therefore has the possibility to become a queer praxis through staging what Bayer has referred to as, and I quote, a clash of epistemologies, end of quote, at the very beginning of learning a new language. My choice to include queer translation activities is not contingent on whether I have members of a specific group in my class. This is not hospitality for those we have in our classroom. It's hospitality for all. This is about correct representation. When I teach pronouns, for example, I always refer to the alternative use of their grammatical gender by emphasizing that it is a construction that is supposed to serve us and not the other way around. This is why students are introduced to the use of they, αυτά, neutral, plural for first person, singular, from their first couple of classes, even though, according to some language instructors, this might cause confusion or indeed could be grammatically wrong. Momentary confusion that we can control in the classroom is a very small price to pay if it means questioning both gender and sexuality stereotypes and misgendering when it comes to our students. In returning to the first half of my title, I understand hospitality not only because the students feel welcome in the classroom, but also in following Ricoeur's narrative hospitality from the text Reflection on a New Ethos from Europe, where he describes as, quote, taking responsibility in imagination and in sympathy for the story of the other through the life narratives which concern the other. Translation in the language classroom allows us to do this, allows us to build on these types of exchanges between different peoples and their histories. A translation act becomes an act of transference that welcomes and incorporates the story of the other. If it is not clear by now, I am queer, and I'm also a strong believer of the queer literacy framework. Not only because it creates an environment hospitable to students of all gender expressions and identities, but because it also allows for critical interventions and interactions with ideas so important to our students. To return to the little quote by Mata I started this brief talk with about how one constructs and translates their own queerness across different languages and geographical spaces, their very lonely text ends like this. Louise Bourgeois wrote, "You pile up associations the way you pile up brick. Memory itself is a form of architecture. These pages are my building. I built it for us. Come in. Tell me a story. I love you. Stay." I want my students to be the best builders they can be as they leave our great institutions and enter the world they are meant to change and make more hospitable and sustainable. For them to be good builders, though, we not only have to teach them the skills, the tools to be able to do so, but also assist them in giving them the sustainable materials they would need to do so. Because, as Audre Lorde has warned us, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So it is our responsibility to assist our students in building their own. Translation tasks allow me to do so from throughout the language sequence, from elementary to advanced. I do hope that at this conference we all agree that they do the same for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for such a wonderful presentation, very inspiring indeed. And I hope this will generate a lot of questions to bring to the table. We will now, I would like to introduce now Stéphanie Ravillon, senior lecturer in the Department of French and Francophone Studies. And she will be talking to us about translation as hospitality, integrating humanitarian storytelling in the L2 classroom. So.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. The project I'm going to present today is currently underway for the first time this semester. So rather than sharing the final product with you, I will instead focus on its genesis, how the project came into being, the how, the why, and the main goals. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge and thank my partner in crime, Claudia Esposito, ici présente, Associate Professor of French at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Brown alumna. During the pandemic, Claudia and I collaborated on openly accessible pedagogical materials on the 2019 film Les Misérables, a film based on a real-life occurrence of police violence that took place in the Paris suburbs a few years back. As the world was struggling with isolation, we wanted to design activities that would allow our students to critically engage with contemporary issues and think about the different ways of consolidating social cohesion and of promoting social justice. As we were reflecting on new avenues for collaboration, we undertook a translation project that we will both implement later this semester in our respective French-English translation classes. An introduction to the theory and practice of translation, the course I'm offering this semester is designed to expand students' range and appreciation of written styles and registers, and it is based on translation exercises and texts reflecting different types of written and oral communication. As part of the course, students engage in a semester-long reflection on the role of translation and translators, as well as on the concept of linguistic hospitality that Nicholas mentioned earlier. So this concept was articulated by French philosopher Paul Ricoeur. In his book on translation, titled On Translation, Ricoeur argues that the art and ethics of translation are invaluable and help us navigate a world that requires translation itself. What Ricoeur does in this book is examine the translator dilemma of choosing between fidelity and betrayal, or equivalence and inadequacy. He provides a philosophical solution to this paradox, articulating his concept of linguistic hospitality. Quote, where the pleasure of dwelling in the other's language is balanced by the pleasure of receiving the foreign word at home in one's own welcoming house. It is with this very idea of linguistic hospitality in mind that we decided to develop a project in conjunction with an NGO called Migrants of the Mediterranean. Migrants of the Mediterranean is an NGO that describes itself as a humanitarian storytelling NGO documenting the individual journey stories of the world's most impoverished and vulnerable people, first in Lampedusa, Italy, and now across Europe. The organization's humanitarian storytelling methodology is a combination of humanitarianism, journalism, and contemporary history, and their methodology encompasses 3 areas: documentation, advocacy, and preservation. Despite their hardships, migrants are often seen and depicted in the news as a generic, faceless, and dehumanized entity, mostly to be feared and avoided. And humanitarian storytelling aims to underscore the human side as opposed to, let's say, the statistical side of people in migrant communities by giving them the opportunity to tell their stories. The NGO has already documented over 100 testimonies, which are all available in the Journey Story Archive. As you can see on their banner, the stories are currently available in English, Spanish, German, and Italian, and our goal is to give our students the opportunity to work collaboratively on the translation of this text as a class project. The project will be part of a broader pedagogical module on the translation of media content and will span a 2-week period. So after a presentation of the NGO's mission and its core values, as well as an overview of the geographical areas where human movement is currently happening in unprecedented ways, we will work together on one short testimony in order to decide on the best way to translate the invariable aspects of the over 100 texts in order to ensure consistency. So together, we will develop a sort of collaborative database that will serve as a resource for the project, a resource tool students will be able to draw on both individually and collectively during their translation and throughout the peer editing process. Students will then proceed to translate into French the text they have been assigned, and we've already categorized all the testimonies according to length to ensure that students translate roughly the same number of words. The rest of the time will be devoted to peer editing. When students have completed the tasks of translating peer editing, they will send me their text for feedback on their translation. Then they will have the opportunity to adjust any inaccuracy their text may contain and reflect on the how and why of this inaccuracy. And finally, I will proofread them one more time before we send them for publication on the NGO's website. Because of the strong emphasis on narrativity that students generally encounter in their language courses, I do not anticipate significant difficulties, as students will be able to draw on their well-developed narrative abilities. What will make this project a truly collaborative endeavor, beyond the design of the activity itself and the fact that it involves students from 2 different universities, one public and one private, so what will make this project truly collaborative is the time we will devote to the peer editing process. Peer editing allows students to work together to compare the translated versions, to analyze differences among them, and to make sure they're understandable, that is, audience-oriented. During the peer editing process, students learn to use a meta-language, which is a key component of critical framing, for talking about text and the writing process. In other words, students become their own as well as each other's critics, and inviting students to explain and discuss their choices is an important step in developing their awareness of not only their own reading and writing processes, but also those of their peers. And by hearing how their classmates attempt to resolve a particular misunderstanding, students can expand their own problem-solving repertoire. The fact that students are trained in peer response procedures throughout the semester is a crucial part of the process and will undoubtedly prove extremely helpful. Students' translation will be published on migrantsofthemediterranean.org, the NGO's website. Thus, this project will culminate in an end product, which will ultimately be in the public domain. And as an aside, I want to add that part of the process the NGO has in place is to follow up with each individual's month and years after the initial interview. So there is potential for ongoing collaboration in the future between our students and this NGO. I anticipate that developing a web-published product that can serve as a resource for others and being credited for it will be highly motivating for students. It will also provide them with an opportunity to use their language skills beyond the classroom and to reflect further on the notion of linguistic hospitality that I mentioned earlier. For the migrants whose stories they will be translating, it will be an opportunity for their testimonies to be heard in their mother tongue, since many of them, if not, in fact, come from countries where French is widely spoken. Ricoeur's metaphor of linguistic hospitality, which he also proposes as a model for other kinds of hospitality, has been productively taken up by others to emphasize the importance of translation in relation to a key current concept, human mobility. For Madhu Kaza, the editor of Kitchen Table Translation, a volume that explores the connection between migrations and translation, and which features immigrant and diasporic translators, I quote, Translation is an act of hospitality. Hospitality conceived not as charity, not as condescension, or even merely tolerance. A hospitality that recognizes both the dignity and the difference of the other. In this model, translation is not about assimilation of the other language or the other body. The impossibility of any particular translation is not a difficulty to be overcome, just as the difference of an immigrant, a refugee, or anyone deemed other is not a difference to be overcome, but rather greeted with care. Translation can be a practice of hospitality that acknowledges that the host too will have to be changed by the encounter. As most of us are now striving to reorient language pedagogy towards a more diverse, relevant, and socially responsive curriculum, it is important to mention the role translation can play to help students learn about and appreciate other cultures. From a broader perspective, translating also raises the question of the role of language in broader debates about migration, for instance, and the kind of understanding and insight translation provides is central to humanistic learning. In other words, the use of translation in a classroom is a way of moving away from a purely lexical and grammatical approach and of providing students with the opportunity to develop skills that prepare them to embrace otherness and to be equally at home with the world and the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, very much. And now we will welcome Elsa Amanatidou, who is a distinguished senior lecturer in the Department of Classics in the program of Modern Greek Studies. Thank you. I just want to say that I didn't mention either, but please, for more information about all these special people, go to the conference website. And please let's welcome Elsa, who's going to be working or talking about translations, right? Translanguages,
Yes.
and in the multiliteracy.
Thank you. I have to thank the organizing committee and for putting together this translation extravaganza. It's a big event, so well done. It's almost, like the Oscars. So, and the prize goes to. My presentation will focus on the affordances of translanguaging for the development of students' critical and digital literacies within a multiliteracies and proficiency-oriented curriculum. The setting will be a second semester undergraduate class, mostly truly novice learners with some heritage learners in the mix. I have chosen this class as an example because, as we all know, active engagement with content within a multiliteracies context at novice level is particularly challenging. The students do not have enough language to connect with material that allows them to critique and analyze discourse and engage in the foreign language with the kind of issues that interest them in their local and global environments. Translanguaging was a term that was first coined to describe language mixing in bilingual contexts and in the education of heritage language students who belonged in a linguistic minority. There was therefore a strong social justice component to this practice, as it was perceived as a conscious effort to decolonize a curriculum in which monolingual ideologies impose themselves on marginalized and racialized multilingual subjects. In today's landscape, and following the emergence of a growing corpus of scholarly interest in translanguage pedagogy in the foreign language classroom, it has become a more fluid and multi-layered term with no universally accepted definition as yet. Now, there is no time to enter the terrain of different definitions, strong or weak translanguaging, but let me say that I deploy translanguaging as a strategy for content and language integrated learning in the context of a beginner class, so that learners who lack adequate proficiency in the language may access and respond to content that would have otherwise been inaccessible to them. And all along, I remain fully cognizant and slightly unapologetic for challenging notions such as target language only pedagogy. So, my example will come from a scaffolded activity that includes translation and translanguaging as tools for information searching and information sharing in collaborative activities in a digital social reading environment. I use the multiliteracies framework, so keep this in mind, to scaffold the activities in stages of rising complexity and affording the students more autonomy and agency as we proceed. The assignment, this particular one, was born out of a module that focused on relationships, using genres of description and narration with a grammatical focus on the structures that students need in order to carry out these functions, to talk about relationships. And the linguistic structures in Greek are mostly the imperfect tense and the aorist. The students had already read a passage in the textbook where a middle-aged couple, a man and a woman, describe how they met as backpacking youths, prancing about on a Greek island, back in what the students thought of as the Paleolithic era, although it was only the late 80s. The textbook had already introduced students to linguistic structures that they needed in order to understand the input in question and produce their own narratives about similar encounters with a memorable other. Needless to say that the students, being young adults in college and invested in issues of social justice, diversity, and inclusion, were somewhat amused, if not taken aback, by the heteronormative codes of the textbook and the portrayal of an exclusively white, able-bodied, gender binary, usually of the same ethnic origin, i.e. Greek. As the members of the class were already filtering their interpretation of the Greek text through their L1 identities and languages, I decided to use an activity that asked them to respond to authentic sources by relying on English. This gave them an alternative perspective and allowed them to use English to transfer meaning, articulate their own interpretative process, and by the nature of their social interaction, create a community that relies on crowdsourcing to investigate and share information. The first part of the activity, which is situated practice in the multiliteracy sequence, invited students to consider in groups the following advertisement and jot down words that they felt were important to describe what they saw in the pictures. Words like agapi, φίλοι, σοκολάτα, αγκαλιά, άντρας, γυναίκα, and of course the word stereotypa, down here, which was easily available to them as a cognate. And we often rely on cognates to make sense of the material, very much like in the, my big fat Greek wedding examples. The second activity invited students to watch in pairs of two a few commercials in the same series where couples of diverse profiles, body types, ethnicity, and sexual orientation sat on a couch narrating their love story. Very much like the end of When Harry Met Sally, if I may date myself.
Ήταν έρωτας από την πρώτη ματιά, ναι.
Είναι σαν να με συμπληρώνει. Αυτό που αγαπάω περισσότερο στην Εύα είναι το πώς μπορεί εμένα και με κάνει καλύτερο.
Αγάπη, I think. Is it agap?
Αγάπη.
Αγάπη.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah.
Μ' άρεσαν τα πάντα πάνω σου.
Oh, что да.
Την αγαπάω ολόκληρη όπως είναι. Εγώ αγαπάω όλο το Δημήτρη.
Okay, I've lost the... Okay, here we are. So in addition to long noticing language in an authentic context, the students also noticed a more representative and diverse imagery and metaphor than in the contrived content of their textbooks, and practice heuristic skills in order to test various hypotheses regarding the wordplay between Greek and English collocations, as well as participating in activities of foreign language discourse analysis by witnessing and reflecting on the ways in which language relates to its social and political context and expresses the values of a particular speaker group. For the post-viewing activity, students were asked to report back to the group in Greek and at surface level the main facts of the stories they watched. For example, names, country of origin, profession, when that was known, where the couple met, when, and so on and so forth. This was an activity in the overt instruction stage of the multiliteracy cycle, which included noticing and using grammar in context. Overt instruction often overlaps with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development theory, where the instructor serves as the knowledgeable other and provides the students with the help they need to briefly describe what they had just watched. A bigger glossary of terms was compiled with the words that kept cropping up, and this also actually challenged me to expand my own vocabulary for beginner's class, to go beyond the current functional routine everyday vocabulary and include some neologisms, because for Greek, words like heteronormativity is a neologism. The penultimate part of the activity, which is the critical framing, was assigned as homework and asked the students to read an unedited article from a Greek news online platform that provided a neat summary of the philosophy behind these groundbreaking commercials and the ensuing backlash from certain sections of the population. First, the students had to annotate and translate into English the words that were essential for their understanding and enjoyment of the text, therefore making it easier for the rest of the group to read together. This is where the crowdsourcing of meaning comes in. Incidentally, we use the Hypothesis platform. Then they had to offer in English or in Greek or both a summary of the main points that attracted their attention and piqued their interest in the perspectives or the practices involved. And you see that code switching within the kind of the same paragraph sometimes. Thus, through an activity that employed translation and translanguaging as an information-seeking tool and as a medium of sharing one interpretative process of an authentic text, students were able to participate in an intercultural project, find out about an issue that has currency in Greek society, the law about same-sex marriage was passed in Greece only a few days ago. And they engaged critically with it while also accessing the text at semantic level and at the level of discourse. It is my belief that no amount of scaffolding would have allowed the students to express themselves in a way that reflects their intellectual level and curiosity had it not been for the affordances of translation and translanguaging. Let me now turn to the last part of my example, where the students apply their knowledge in creative ways, coming up with a product that they own. Those of you who know me and those of you who have been collaborating with me, thank you for being so great over the years. Know that subtitling is a big passion of mine in the language classroom. So the learning with subtitles activity was already part of the module's ecology. It was grounded in prior context and included all the activities that I showed you earlier, previewing to connect with the text visually and at basic comprehension level, followed by a compilation of keywords, noticing grammar in context, overt instruction, and finally the collaborative activity that provided critical framing, followed by transformed practice. So what is transformed practice? First of all, the transcription of the video. The students carried out the transcription in a Google Doc. This included peer editing and overt feedback by me. Interlingual translation was next. Oops, going ahead of myself, stop. And I must say that even though the transcript required a consensus by all, the translation itself did not, and students often had different kind of metalinguistic reflections and made different stylistic choices when they translated, subtitled rather, the same video. So they were all remarkably motivated to learn about discourse and how the L2 language and cultures interact in order to convey a sense of reality, values, and identity. The question of assessment, not just of the translation, but also of the subtitling, and the fact that it was all a collaborative task is a bigger issue that I hope we'll be able to talk to another day. But I'm happy to direct you to bibliography. There is a bibliography at the end of this video. So here's the students' work. Oh, nope. Help. Okay, found it. I'm just gonna show you brief, very brief.
Λοιπόν, εγώ είμαι ο Γιάννης.
Εγώ είμαι ο Νεκτάριος.
Είμαστε μαζί 7,5 χρόνια. Μένουμε μαζί. Πρόσφατα υιοθετήσαμε και ένα μικρό πουτάβι.
Όταν το είναι πρώτη φορά, δεν φανταζόμουν ότι θα είμαστε τόσο καιρό για κανένα λόγο.
Από το πρώτο ραντεβού συνειδητοποίησαμε ότι δεν έχουμε τίποτα κοινό. Και είπαμε ότι, αξίζει.
Okay, so let me conclude by saying that my aim as a foreign language educator is not to teach translation, not to train students as professional translators, even though there is a professionalization aspect to this endeavor, as well as a clear link to the so-called 20th century skills. By shifting the focus on translation and translanguage as tools in a literacy-oriented curriculum, I have experienced firsthand its potential for exploiting the multimodality of meaning in authentic contexts and therefore facilitating access to content that is appropriate to my students' intellectual level and is therefore motivating for them pursuing proficiency further, studying harder, so they may access content faster. It's also a great potential for engaging our students in metalinguistic and metacultural reflections that promote their intercultural awareness, familiarity with metaphor, wordplay, ambiguity, cultural equivalence, or the impossibility of it. In addition to this meta, let's not forget the usefulness of the translation and subtitling environment for the development of listening and reading, comprehension, writing with accuracy, and the type of clarity or ambiguity that respects the linguistic and cultural conventions of both languaging. And finally, it cannot be underestimated how important it is to involve our students in fruitful collaborations with their peers and enable them to look at translation as task-based learning as well as content-based. The outcome of translation and subtitling in particular is a linguistic and cultural product of their own, one that can be shared with other students, contribute to their education and enjoyment of the language and culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elsa, and thank you again to the three of you. It's very, very interesting, and there are a number of elements that I can find in your three presentations, like a thread that is very interesting. And I invite you first to maybe find those common points among you, and maybe we can open later the floor for questions. One of the things that have really struck me and touched me deeply, and maybe because I very much think in some ways, the sense of hospitality, the idea of hospitality in translation and language teaching in the classroom, collaboration, the concept of other and otherness. I love the concept of acceptance and no tolerance. I think they're very crucial in these endeavors. And you know, using all of the resources, the linguistic and cultural resources in the classroom and the students bring to the classroom, and use their own individuality, imagination, creativity to come to work in this, but also at the same time taking care of the skill, the tools that we need to really help them develop so that they can achieve these things. So I don't want to say anything else. Thank you very much. It's very, very inspiring, but let's listen to you, and then questions that you may all have, you're welcome, and thank you.
I mean, we've been discussing.
We're always talking to each other.
Yeah, we're always talking to each other. So if someone has... Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful. Oh, darn it. Hi, thank you for those wonderful and really fascinating set of papers. I think since you've all obviously you're in conversation with one another and you've used similar terms, I'll perhaps just pose these two questions. Two questions to the wider group. One is about terminology, and then the other is about methodology. So the terminology question is the distinction, and perhaps this is for you, Elsa Amanatidou, in particular. Translation and versus interpretation as two related but different phenomena. So understanding that as part of the project there, I was reading about it before coming, the compassionate encounter, the follow-up, these are interpersonal, immediate relationships that kind of, you know, could potentially move over that hiatus that gives you the distance with which one is able to translate. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about, yes, translation and interpretation, how they work together or don't. And then the question of translanguaging, maybe this is betraying my age, but just in as much as immersion is kind of the going, right? Like immersion is the best way to learn a language. I'm wondering if you can talk about translanguaging in the context of the immersive classroom.
You can start from the second question.
Sure.
So let's start from the end. I did say that I remain unapologetic about challenging the immersion-only pedagogy. I've been a language teacher for, 33 years. So I've seen the movement, all the trends in the methods. And we have been very firmly stuck in the community language teaching method for many years, too many years for my liking. I've always felt that the community language teaching approach infantilizes students enormously with its reliance on functions and negotiations and information gap technology. Everything has got a very instrumentalist. And I've always looked at a more kind of, I always had a preference for a more constitutive notion of language rather than instrumentalist. And when the literacy movement started making waves, I thought that I could combine approaches that incorporated literacy as an aim and as a practice alongside my commitment to enabling my students, to creating the conditions for them to communicate effectively in the language. The thing is, the students wanted to communicate beyond eating, drinking, catching a bus, going to Mykonos, ordering souvlaki, and dancing and breaking plates. It also happened that a lot of those textbooks created a very exoticized picture of Greek culture that was basically aimed at tourists, not at people who wanted to become translingual and transcultural, which was my own educational objective. So what I do with the translanguaging, I engineer its use in modules, in specific modules where the students have intellectual needs and things to say that go beyond the functional. So, for example, I didn't use translanguaging and translation when we, language courses, topics, subtopics, functions, and the linguistic structures you need to carry out these functions. Basically, every textbook is organized along this notion. So, when it actually comes to constructing their identity in Greek, then I introduce the translanguaging. So this is the first activity I do in second semester Greek. These are students who've only had a few months of Greek behind them. And it's important for me to take them beyond that exoticized version of Greece. So translanguaging affords me this opportunity. The class remains immersive a lot of the time, and a lot of these activities are assigned as homework or online engagement. But the feedback is great. The students appreciate it, and they never feel that I'm stealing time from their practice. In fact, they feel very proud that they're able to access authentic sources in this way. This lasts 3 weeks at the most, and it's alongside my other work. It doesn't take over. It's an organic part of my module.
Well, I completely agree. Obviously, we discussed this. I've been teaching half that, and I still remember there is this interesting meta language about what we do as instructors, and then there is the practice of teaching within those spaces. And as fascinated as I can be with here is interpretation, is translation always interpretation? Are we asking for an original? We're very good friends with Karen Emery, who has been writing on the originals. I teach both classes in translation, Like I teach this class on queer bodies from antiquity until today and elementary language classes. So in those two classes, I do very different things with translation. In elementary one, obviously it's about understanding, judging how these words work for them, how they could translate, or should they be translated in another language? Does it become something else? What do we do with the global ways of that reworking, let's say? And in the advanced seminar, the students read, for example, Bacchae by Anne Carson, the translation by Anne Carson, and how problematic it is for trans bodies, for drag. And therefore, the students who understand ancient Greek and then they get Carson's translation, because it includes both, they do very different things in theorizing about how we read a body, right? Because the language of the seminar is English. So for me, there is how we talk about what we're doing and then what the students are interested. I don't believe in immersion. I think it's a bubble. I think it's a fake thing. I am Cypriot, which means I was taught a different language at school than the one I was speaking at home. For me, there is always what we call diglossia in a traditional sort of way. So to me, it was always a question of moving around languages. So I don't believe in the forced singularity of language. That's one. And two, and I'm completely unashamed about this, there are moments in the classroom in general where I can explain a very complicated grammatical phenomenon in like 2 minutes and not waste the time of the students than me trying to play hoops and going around to find other sort of ways.
We call it verbal acrobatics.
Okay. I have to do with the verbal acrobatics. So I think, yes, there is the theoretical, which is interesting, and then there is the practical. Our students need more from us. And from a personal experience, and this is anecdotal, but I know with other colleagues at Columbia, those of us who employ this sort of approach to teaching have attracted queer students that have no connection to those languages, interested in learning those languages because they feel they can explore themselves within those languages. So I've had students asking them, why are you learning Greek? And they're like, oh, I just want to learn Greek. And then they're like, oh, because it allows me to explore this sort of way of the language, and it's a different space, and it's the Mediterranean, and I'm interested in it. So you see that people feel the need to find those connections. And translation activities allow this for us to do that. I think Stephanie has a very different situation because she teaches a class on translation. So she...
Yeah, my class
and she also teaches a Romance language.
Yes,
so that is very different.
And it's a translation class. So I don't think the approach is very different, but yes, the class itself definitely is.
But it allows you to do different sort of things in there.
Do you want to talk about the interpretive process in translation and interpretation? That was also part of the question.
The first one.
Because you're actually
the project that you're working on.
Yes. So were you thinking about translation as an interpretation act or more about interpretation as?
I'm really asking you actually.
Okay.
In the context of building the project.
Yeah.
Were you using translation and interpretation interchangeably, or are they two separate constituent parts of the process of bringing stories to life?
So you're meaning interpretation as the
oral, immediate.
Yes, no. I mean all the testimonies are in the public domain, so the students will not actually meet the migrants. So there's no interview process interpretation for the community. It's actually when we are
working from text.
Yes, they're working from text, and it's actually very difficult for us, those of us who teach French in this area, to find community service activities. So I know that Nidia is doing this in her translation class, and it's not really something that I could do in the same way. So this this project is very important to me because it's something that we will be able to do, but there's no interpretation. The students will not be interpreters in this case.
there is someone. Hi.
Yes.
I have a microphone.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your presentations. It was really enlightening. And I guess I'm wondering, for those of you that do teach like gender inclusive language in the languages that you're teaching, kind of what experiences your students have, and then going out into the world and attempting to apply that, like what kind of pushback they get or how you prepare them for an inevitable pushback. I mean, just in speaking Spanish and in teaching Spanish, like understanding that I'm teaching them kind of I'm not a language professor, so I'm not going to probably use the right words, but I feel like I'm teaching them a dialect or something of Spanish, and then they go out into the world speaking this other dialect, and so then they're going to get this inevitable pushback. So like, how do you prepare them for that, and what kind of experiences do you see from your students in that regard?
So that's an excellent question, because you're always situating it in the real historical understanding of this. In my case, there are communities in Greece, organizations that I bring students in touch with. So they do talk with people that are actually living in Greece. At the same time, their identities are challenged and erased every day of their lives, depending on where they are, even in this country. So it's not that you have to, it's not that when you go to Greece or Cyprus, all of a sudden people will react to you in a very different way than you're used to in this country. So the affect part, unfortunately, is there, and especially in this country with the regulations and the laws happening, or the killing of people, children in schools, they are not sort of unaware of what it means to be queer. My effort, my hope is to give them hope of communities, those small sachets of communities. So instead of emphasizing on the harshness of that community, I try to build on the tenderness of that community. And also what I find and I've had some other examples that I've decided not to use. It's an open space of interpretation and choosing yourself. There is no one way of, for example, being non-binary in Greek. Some people like to use the third person, some do not, some keep there. I've had non-binary students that said, okay, I'm gonna keep they in English, but in Greek, I don't feel comfortable yet. And then I meet them a few years later and they have embraced it and they love having it. So what I find more interesting about this is the students that don't know that experience. And that's where I see the most learning, because they are the ones that have the questions on how to speak or how to do it. And with heritage learners, many of them in this country and elsewhere are connected to the church because they're forced to go to Greek school, and Greek school is usually, within a church. So it's a traumatic experience for them as well, but they want this language. So they also have that space. So actual real life experience, the ability to, in real life, in real time process creation of identities that could change, that could shift. They're not trees, they can move around, they can choose what works for them. They move around this sort of idea. That's my experience, real life experience and hope. Because there's so much negativity, I don't want to bring more of that in my classroom. So here's a community, they're struggling, but they can help you. And they've met with them. And now I'm taking a group of students in Athens in May. And we're meeting with a group of queer refugees in Athens as part of the activities of the Literary Walks of Athens. Whereas that becomes a lived experience of an otherness and a tenderness that resists. I would disagree with dialect. I don't believe in dominant languages. I think they're a political choice, personally. Again, Cypriot. So it's a dialect as much as the standard version of the dialect is. I believe in context, right? So if you go to this professional space, if you go to the police, if you go to court, if you go there, you need to code switch as you do elsewhere. But dialect and non-dialect keeps the dominance, keeps the hegemony, keeps the power, keeps the right versus wrong, keeps the geographic distance. So it's like, here is official language, And here is everything else. But that's I don't know what you do.
Yeah. Something similar.
Is it okay? Thank you so much. This is wonderful. So in particular, I was struck by Elsa's use of a fan subtitling, right? Which I think is very powerful. And I was wondering, especially thinking about languages through it, like Finnish would work perfectly. It's always non-binary, right? Because there is no gender marked on pronouns or no verbal morphology or any of that. But many languages are distinctly, oftentimes, in a simple binary, masculine and feminine, sometimes neuter or other common gender, whatever. So from fan sub, which I love, by the way, what about fan dub? So students could actually explore non-binary uses of the language, trying to match prosody and quote unquote expert speaker delivery, and work on this as a way of benefiting oral language production while also attuning to the variabilities that are possible in the expression of gender and non-gendered identities, sexual expression, et cetera. And I just think that that's such a rich area for exploration, and I would love to hear and learn from your responses to this idea. Not that you haven't thought about it before. From the back channeling, it sounds like
in fact, we
2016 for you all. But yeah, thank you.
Stephanie can talk about it because we often do a kind of a double act presentation on subtitling and dubbing. So
yeah. So, but it's interesting because I did this dubbing activity in the past, but never with this idea of gender and identity. But it's a great idea. So something to think about.
Yeah.
Themselves.
They can hear it out loud.
Yeah. In ways that might be very interesting, including, as Judith Butler would want to remind us, performing any gender is a drag, or any gender is in fact performative. And you can, some may disagree, but I mean, I think that's a lovely way to engage the play and the flexibility and fluidity that might be very relevant to these students as they evolve into the kinds of people, hopefully perennially, that they continue to become.
It's a great idea. Thank you. You gave us a great idea to take this further.
But as a point about that language, I think Judith disagrees with that now in terms of saying that. But again, the language, gendered languages, Greek, and I actually assigned a poem a couple of weeks ago, can be activist in that use, and then it disappears into English. So it's not that English allows for more. It's not a hegemonic use of the language. There is this Greek poet writing in the 50s that turned human into feminine by using an article. And then I've asked my students, and they all had to work on translating that poem and finding ways to say, what is ianthropos? Because Greek has gendered ways of doing it. And they understand also the lack of ability to do that. They were like, but English is so limited, I cannot do it. Yeah, but how do you do it? How do you bring that tension into the language? How do you break down like human, man, mankind, woman, man? They were translating in so many creative ways that enriched their version of English. So I don't think it's just a how do I, but it's a very sort of reciprocal relationship when it comes to gendered languages, and the act of translation in a language classroom on that front.
I think we have to give these people a break before the keynote.
They're exhausted.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nydia.
Thank you, Nydia.